if we go back to the reference and the manifest of the deep tech momentum, we know it's all about the deep tech renaissance. And going back to the renaissance, we can see that they did not, or the Medici family did not just operate in Florence, they built networks across borders, and that's exactly, I think, what our previous conversation just exhibited. But what made the Medici family truly powerful is that they did not just fund innovation, they shaped the rules that allowed it to flourish. Right now, Europe is doing something similar, but on a continental scale. The European Innovation Council is being enhanced, the Scale Up Europe Fund is taking shape, and the European Competitiveness Fund is on the table. These are not small bets, and the people that are making this, or these decisions and putting this forward, are in this very room. These people are coming in from 4 different perspectives. Professor Dr. Carsten Dreher, who chairs Innovation Management at the Freie Universität Berlin, from the research perspective. He's joined alongside Michael Schäfer, the president of the European Innovation Council, the institute backing Europe's most ambitious deep tech startups, as well as Christian Ehler, who is a member of the European Parliament, I suppose the person who's turning the ambition into legislation, as well as Natalie Berger, who is the director at the European Commission Directorate General for Internal Market, Industry, Entrepreneurship and SME. Wow, that's a long title. You are the person responsible for making sure the policy actually lands where it's supposed to. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for our 4 panelists. I'm going to pass this on. Enjoy, have fun.
Wow, thank you.
Wherever you want, please.
I take the front seats.
So, welcome. I'm not so sure whether I will put up the academic perspective too much. I was hired here as a facilitator. So, welcome to this panel on fostering deep tech in Europe, from research innovation to Scale Up Europe Fund, or in short, what is in for you from the European policy side. And to give you a short overview is that the European Union is active for deep tech companies in many areas. There are considerations on regulatory or activities for regulatory reform. EU incorporated the regulatory sandboxes where new solutions can be tested out, or the discussions about the internal market for capital, as well as innovative public and corporate procurement. And there is indeed a whole side of financial support for deep tech companies through the European Innovation Council, and through the activities which Natalie Berger is responsible for in the DG GROW, which is the short version of the long name. The lady just told us. And having said that, I will ask all these the representatives here on the panel on what they are doing at the moment, but there is more to come. As you probably have heard about the Draghi report about European competitiveness, and it's basically highlighting the innovation drivenness regarding competitiveness. So Mario Draghi is pushing for strategic autonomy by establishing new technology pathways, and this should be in the hand of the European Union in order to ensure our strategic autonomy in the new global perspectives as well. For that, the Commission has tabled on July 16th provisions on the next framework program on research and innovation. It's number 10. So if you hear from the panel FP10, then it's this new framework program on research and innovation, which has proposed by the Commission to have a budget about 175 billion, whereas 36.5 billion for the European Innovation Council, if the European Council as well as the European Parliament goes along with it. In addition, there was a new instrument or new fund proposed called the European Competitiveness Fund, which should be aligned to the framework program and has a separate budget of another 231 billion euro. That is lying on the table. At the moment, the negotiations are going on, and we have core players who are in the process involved. Having said that, and since we have only 40 minutes for our panel, I would immediately go into the subject. The panel was kindly already introduced by our hosts here. We have Michael Schäfer, the president of the European Innovation Council. We have Nathalie Berger from the DG GROW for competitiveness coordination. And we have Christian Ehler, who is a rapporteur on both files, on the framework program as well as on the European Competitiveness Fund. And the debates are going on within the Commission, the EU, the Council working groups and the Parliament, and the trilogue will hopefully start after summer if there are no delays in the pre-debates at the moment. So having said that, I would like to ask Michael first. So I'm not sure whether everybody knows what the EIC is doing and what its achievements are. And so what does the EIC do, and what were the achievements so far, considering a period from 21 until now? Michael.
Well, we are actually the startup of the European Union. So we are funding the startups, but we are a startup ourselves, emerged in 2017, basically to cover the big European problem. We are good in research, we are okay in patents, we are not very good in startups, and we are even worse in scale-ups. So basically, the instrument has been designed with several instruments to cover the valley of death. It has been foreseen for this period, 2021-2027, with 10.8 billion euros. And we have by now, let's say by the end of the week, because we are evaluating proposals this week, by the end of the week we will have 850 companies funded in deep tech, startups and scale-ups. It's important to say deep tech because not any startup can come and is eligible. There needs to be a major technological challenge with also, let's say, a long valley of death. So an expectation that it will take 3, 5, 7 years before companies break even. 805 companies, we have a very substantial portfolio in quantum. We have a sizable portfolio in energy. We also still play a role in semiconductors and also in the novel generation morphotonics. We have a very sizable health portfolio. Think of AI in health, but also think of medical devices, of pharma a bit. And we have also some food, proteins, Earth observation. So we cover a number of fields, always deep tech. What's also important to have in mind, 805 companies, almost 11 billion euros, makes of the EIC one of the biggest investors in Europe and in some areas in the world. But we only fund 5% of applicants, and we fund only 0.2% of high-tech startups. So I often say the EIC is also the icing on the cake. It is building a layer, an ecosystem on top of what member states do, and in some member states like the federal state of Germany or in the Netherlands where the provinces have a strong role, we also on top of what regions do. So even in a city that is successful like Berlin, we only have about 12 beneficiaries. So it's not 12 companies that are going to change the regional economy of Berlin. But the 12 is a proof that there is a startup environment in Berlin that is vibrant enough also to generate those deep tech startups.
Thank you very much, Michael. Nathalie, DG GROW is overlooking InvestEU and other sectoral policies. Where and how do you address really deep tech companies?
Thank you. Well, I think we need to look at the situation in Europe today and what is needed. We have a situation where we have ideas, we have brain powers, we have innovators, inventors, and you said it, Michael, with a very strong and helpful intervention from the European Innovation Council. Where we have a problem, where you said we're not so good, is when we get to startup and then to scale up, where we have an innovation gap. And this is where we need to get our different ways of acting all together. So we have been using InvestEU over the current multi-annual budgetary period, so over the last 7 years, with a huge success. We have been able to mobilize more than 280 billion of investments through providing guarantees. I would say that now the Commission is really stepping up its intervention in order to support the deep tech. We are bringing equity onto the table. So we are creating a simpler regulatory framework. We have been presenting the European Accelerator Act, where, for example, we propose that the member state designate innovation acceleration valleys, territories in the member state, where the companies will be able to enjoy a more favorable environment, having quicker, faster access to permitting, sometimes benefiting from regulatory sandboxes. And we are working, for example, in the area of batteries. We're working on a battery support facility that is going to provide interest-free loans now in the coming 2 years. We were together in a panel on batteries just a few minutes ago, and we know that this is an absolutely critical area of our value chain. So we are multiplying our interventions. On the regulatory framework, we are simplifying the rules on public procurement in order to make sure that we can create demand, we can create a market for our European companies. In the context of the Accelerator Act, there is the very important concept of Made in Europe. Where we're talking about critical areas and critical industry, we want to support the European industry. And then last but not least, because this is going to be the cherry on the cake, the most important part of it, we come to the general funding. So far, we have had a wide range of programs that have been very successful, but for the next multi-annual financial framework, we have proposed to group the different programs, and to go for a single European Competitiveness Fund. And this European Competitiveness Fund will allow us to activate a wide range of instruments in order to de-risk the market for investors and in order to intervene through grants, through procurements, through loans, etc., etc. And of course, now we are in the hands of the co-legislators, and particularly in the hands of Mr. Ehler.
Thank you for saying that. We will discuss about the proposals in a minute. Christian, the Commission has tabled the mid-financial framework program, introducing a new framework program for research and innovation, number 10, and the European Competitiveness Fund. But my first question on that is, what is then with the new proposals really in for deep tech companies?
I mean, first of all, I mean, usually the Parliament is highly critical about the Commission and believes that we know what the world it is, that is mirrored somehow by the Council. But I think what we should highlight is that the European institution had something understood. There is nothing like this stimulus response models anymore. We say we have a framework program and then that leads to innovation, or we deepen the market, but we don't reflect then what is the situation on the financial markets. So in a way, I think the proposal of the Commission is so far very interesting, because for the first time it's like on a matrix. We're saying these things we want to address, these are the instruments, and then what would be sweet spots, how can we cumulative use public money, how do we use public procurement for creating demand, what do we believe, although it's not a very popular word in Brussels, but what we need in terms of deregulation. We have deregulation proposals relating to specific industries. So in a way, I think the biggest message so far is it is a very complex, but not complex in a negative sense. It's a coherent approach. And I think that is the reality. I mean, if you're a startup, yes, you look for VC capital. If you're a startup, you look for whether you can scale up your market. So do you have access to the other markets in Europe? Or are you told by your VC capital fund that go to the US, you can scale up your business much more easily in the American market? I mean, there's a multitude of challenges for a company. And I think for the first time, there's a relatively coherent approach by the Union. And this is because geopolitically, and that might be the last very political sentence I'm going to say, because usually politicians go to the horizon if they ask about details. But I think what we have to understand is we are in a completely different setting. We understand that we had been neglecting for more or less 20 years the deepening of the European market, because growth was literally coming from globalization. And I think that model at least is slowing down. We might even see a certain end to that model. So right now, to use, I think, what had been making this model so successful, and it was the strength of the European market, that is a new prerogative, and I think in the center of all the attempts. But in practical terms, I mean, the funnel is big. We will have the biggest. I mean, it's a little bit, you rightly say, we do good on research. But I mean, in practical terms, it is in a public allocation of funds. You know, it is a very complicated achievement to say we're going to have most likely the biggest research and innovation program in the world, civilian one. So 175 billion. So starting from, let's say, the lowest part of the value chain or the supply chain or whatever you would call it in terms of innovation. I mean, it's a big yes. And then we are accompanying that for the first time by a financial instrument, which is really funded by a research program, by that even closely connected to that. And it could be, and that's a takeaway from me and my really last sentence, what I see is that we have much more integrated policies. So I could envisage, for example, if we are granting public money, instead of going to universities and saying we want to have a gender program or whatever, and I don't question that, but wouldn't it be an idea to say the prerequisite that you get public innovation funding is that you have a startup strategy for your institution? Because let's be honest, I mean, that's the starting point, and the universities and the academia are still very risk averse. You don't have any benefit as a university if you care about the next generation of entrepreneurs. So why should we say one prerequisite for public funding is simply, if it fits to the institution, that you have to have a scale-up, a startup strategy within your academic institutions. And I think this more integrated approach, this broad range of instruments which are accompanying a lot of the challenges ahead for startup companies or entrepreneurs, I think that's the new.
But sorry for insisting on that. My question is, what is in for deep tech companies? So I understood that there is some cherry picking possibilities because they hold a range or a matrix, but really, how will it work? And because these are deep tech companies and investors who would like to invest into such companies. So I understand the political logic, but I really want to where do you think, how much of the funds are really assigned for deep techs, and what are the most prominent instruments you see on the horizon?
I mean, if I say that bluntly, we haven't the smartest VC capital market in the world. That's the reason why I'm wearing a tie, by the way. I've been CEO of one of the biggest biotechnology centers in Germany. I know the German Sparkassen when they wanted to have a biotechnology fund, and then there was a big bubble, and this was the end of it. Most of the VC capital in Europe is looking for a deep tech investment, yes, and then they go desperate because they have a mathematical approach to their portfolio and saying, where do I get a pizza delivery service? So they're not really dedicated deep tech technology funds in Europe as it is in the United States. There are multiple for a reason. So what is is that Europe is saying we are investing not in the market, we are not generally looking for financial instruments. We say we have dedicated instruments for deep tech. I mean, out of a research program to spend then in the end 30 billion euro on a dedicated financial instrument is unseen. I mean, you might say because in China they have a state-driven policy, and in the United States they have a functioning market. But I think you shouldn't forget the allocation processes in our societies are hostile. People want to have money for housing and for forever. And the Commission sets now the priority and saying this is about innovation. This is about startup companies. It's no longer subsidizing Siemens forever. It is that we set the priorities in terms of DTech, startup companies, and we have a dedicated instrument. And Carsten, I had the discussion with the Commission, and you have a shining example of brightness here. But the discussion was that the Parliament, when we established the EIC, we said to the Commission, read our lips, you can lose money. The worst thing you can tell to a public servant is that they can allow money. It's like, it was hysteria in the beginning when we said, you're going to lose money. You're allowed to lose money. And this is a kind of change of mindset, which is, in your merciless eyes, relatively humble, but in terms of the public perception, how to spend public money, it is a revolution.
Michael, you are representing the risk takers in the in that game, and hopefully in the next part. So the EIC was designed in order to draw more private capital in more riskier waters, if I remember the setup phase of that, the EIC. So how the new EIC will look like when after 1st of January 28, and what are new elements and what you will do with the significantly increased budget if it goes through the Council?
I recently went back in history, and the original objective of the EIC was to attract €2 of private capital for each euro of public one. The stand now this week is 1 to 3.5. So the system has been much more successful in attracting private money, also because part of the VCs that were doing a lot of software as a service discovered that the IP position of software is not very strong, and that basically in deep tech you have a much stronger intellectual property position. So that's already a movement that works well. What we also have done, so I'm very grateful to the context around us, because the EIC can experiment a lot. The second experiment was to bring the 110 most frequent investors in a trusted investor network to improve the syndication process, but also to create an ecosystem of investors that basically learn from each other and join from each other. So we have 110 private investors that are, let's say, regularly investing with us. And a new novel tool, you might have read it this week, is a scale-up fund where basically the European Commission proposed to put in 1 billion, and a number of pension funds, insurers, life insurers, bring in 4 billion euros. So basically as a fund to invest. 5 billion is modest. I've been quite active in getting the Dutch pension fund in, which is my pension, by the way. But they only put 0.05% of their assets. But that's the start. And 0.05 is 250 million. So it's not free drink. So
what will be new in the next period?
So in the next period, it's important to keep that, let's say, that leverage effect, because improving funding for deep tech is one thing, but let's say improving the financial landscape as a whole is also an important thing. And I think it was Macron who mentioned it, that every year Europeans invest 600 billion euros of their savings and pensions in the US. Mm-hmm. If we would invest it in Europe, and not in real estate, but in the real economy, that is really a game changer. So I think that the EIC should be also in the next period, with 30 billion euros, again, the spark in changing the economic system. So for us as an EIC board, it's very important to be very active in these kind of events. I do about 30 a year, but also to connect all these actors in an ecosystem. And this day is also a day of that ecosystem. So it's also important to strengthen the feeling of, let's say, a community, of sharing risks together. And I think the next step is also, like Nathalie has mentioned, we also have to strengthen the linkage to industrialization. Because the real thing is, people really feel it if, let's say, if blue collars have to make it on a CNC machine. And if, let's say, all citizens can buy it in a drugstore or in a supermarket. So we have to do more, let's say, downstream. And I see in my board also a focus of attention for the early seed to much more Series B, C, and what are the barriers to move on. And there, of course, the regulatory agenda of the Commission is also important. And we have often companies saying to us, yeah, you're my shareholder, but by the way, you're also the regulator. Can you change that regulation because it's hampering us? Well, I cannot do that. But the Commission and the Parliament are, of course, important actors in assuring that the whole ecosystem, all the set of conditions, is innovation supportive.
So what is
if I may say, for example, in terms of coherency, because nobody believes politicians that say coherent, in parallel we do a revision of the EVCA regulation. This is the conditionalities how pension funds can invest. So now that's what I mean. We don't raise an expectation saying we put a little bit of money off the table and pension funds now invest. We have to set also the regulatory framework that, because we had a relatively simplistic discussion which didn't work, because I mean the regulatory conditionalities in member states in general, the European regulation doesn't fit for that. So we are revising that, and I would see that in the end of 27 we might be, or even earlier, we might see a proposal on the table and then setting a more positive framework that it works actually.
But Natalie, coming to you, that the European Competitiveness Fund is a new kid on the block, so to speak, and how it will be coordinated with the framework program, and how that we deal with the uncertainties. We have deep tech, and Christian has already raised the interlinkages with the regulatory environment.
Well, you know, we need to play collectively. We need to lead integrated strategies. We need to look at these issues from different angles. So if you want us to become really competitive and really support the deep techs, etc., we need to have something that is going to make sure that when we support a project from the level of research, I mean from research, pre-seed, seed, etc., we continue afterwards to support the development of the project once we get to the implementation of the project. So the proposal is that we have a coupling between Horizon Europe and between the Competitiveness Fund. But if you allow me, I would like to come back to things that have been said before, because I think they're extremely important. What do we need to do for the deep techs? We need to give them an easy, deep tech-friendly regulatory environment. So what have we done in the European Commission? We've tabled a number of omnibus proposals in order to simplify the regulatory framework. And this is going to be very important. But it is not enough. What should we do then? We need to give them the right toolbox in order to be able to advance their interests. So we are proposing the creation of a specific company, the European Inc., the 28th regime. You know, the company that deep techs or other innovators should be able to create within less than 24 hours and with 100 euros, etc., and that should benefit from a faster permitting regime. Then, financing. We have been talking about public finance. Remember Mr. Letta, what did he say? We need 750, 800 billion euros investment per year. With the Recovery and Resilience Facility, we've had 764 billion investments over 7 years. Since then, the European Central Bank said we need 1,200 billion euros investment per year. We're not going to get there only through public investment. Whatever the amounts that we can have for the Competitiveness Fund, for the EIC, for Horizon Europe, for our Innovation Fund, for Tech EU, for our battery facility, etc., we need private investors to be on the ball and to invest here. So we need to create the conditions in Europe for the private investors to invest and to stop sending their money onto the US. So for that, all needs to be articulated with establishing a deep and liquid capital markets union. So that's the project of a savings and investment union, whereby we want to mobilize the tens of trillions of savings that have been accumulated in the European Union over the last few years for people to invest in equity. For this, there is a big regulatory review of all the rules relating to securitization, relating to institutional investors' investments. I mean, I have been negotiating some of these instruments, Solvency II, IOP II, the banking regulation, etc. What is it that we had there? After the great financial crisis, we have set very prudent rules on banks' investments, on insurers' investments, on pension funds' investments. Now we need to look back and see where is it that we can bring relief, that we can bring simplification without creating any risk for financial stability in the European Union. The Commission has been tabling proposals on securitization. The co-legislators are now entering in trilogue negotiations on securitization, and we hope that soon we will be able to have a framework that will facilitate, that will incentivize slightly more riskier investments. Talking about insurers, talking about pension funds, we have modified the prudential rules in order to give a bonus, a prudential bonus for institutional investors, investment in projects that are supported by the European Investment Bank and the European Investment Fund. So you see, and I'm not going to enter into more details on this, but we are going to get there by a framework of very well articulated and coordinated actions. And we need all to work together. So I hope there are investors in this room, and I hope that these investors will come all together with us, with the European institutions, joining where we bring guarantees to implement these instruments and to bring equity, to bring capital to support the development of the deep techs in Europe.
I was pinching Christian, and now I have to insist on you with my question. So I understand that all the activities you are doing, and I learned from Michael and from my activities regarding the EIC that there isn't some sort of intervention logic. So if everything works out like you have just presented on the regulatory side, do you still need the European Competitiveness Fund, or what is the idea? You were collecting old programs, and are you selling us old wine in new bottles, or what is? I understand the logic on the regulatory aspect. Everybody is on the same page, I think, here on the podium at least, and so I wonder, what is then the logic, the rationale of the ECF, and what is the intervention logic of the 24 instruments you were collecting?
I would focus on two aspects. The one which is that we're bringing equity and that we're investing. And Mr. Eller said it, about this revolutionizing idea that there is a risk that we may lose money. So we have now European institutions that are ready to put equity on the table and to come and provide guarantees and to risk losing money. So that's not new old one in new bottle. That's new wine, but I hope the new one is going to be as good as the old one. Second, what is key is the multiplier effect. With the EU Invest program, we've had a multiplier effect of around 13.4, with what we have been investing in terms of guarantees. So if we bring all this on the table with our, if I may call it like that, bazooka, that the Competitiveness Fund is going to be in Horizon Europe, we should be able to mobilize investments that will go far beyond. Because 450 or 500 billion euros by itself for 7 years is not that much.
So that's the reason why I asked that. So I understood that the EIC has a certain intervention logic. So you're planning on ARPA and the Scale Up Europe Fund and other activities which has a clear mission. So can you elaborate, Michael, a little bit on these approaches which will be introduced soon or in the next framework program?
Well, there are two elements which are important. One is the often used ARPA or DARPA approach, which is an American approach, so I'm still waiting for a European name. But it's basically to have a strategic view by theme of how to move, let's say, technologies from very early TRL 1.2 to TRL 10. So basically a coherence in the instrument of saying there should be a number of priorities. Of course, it's up to the politicians to set the priorities, but also we have an EIC, we have an advisory role in defining them. And what is also important is to have a feature of a strong program management. That basically means looking at the coherence of a portfolio, looking at what is missing. And what is also important, it takes between 16 and 29 years to move from TRL1 to TRL9. And what we saw is that between 5 and 10 years of that is lost in applying for the next round of funding. So what is also important is to have what we call in the EIC board a fast lane. So basically, if you are in a system and you perform well according to the milestones, basically it's easier to go to the next stage of funding. So the fast lane is also an important concept besides, let's say, a strong program management approach. And that also requires a certain level of autonomy and a certain level of trust from the politicians to see what happens. And quite interesting, I've been running a regional fund of a Dutch province, and public investment funds are profitable. And even I see the current EIC portfolio, we have so many unicorns already in portfolio that we are almost break even by now. So the public, because of all the constraints of public funding, of being a bit, let's say, secure in terms of not doing silly things, but doing high-risk technology investment, the EIC is likely to become, let's say, a break-even or a profitable activity.
So, for the last round, Christian, you are drafting the reports for the FP10 and for the ECF, for European Competitiveness Fund, together with your colleagues. So, where do you see the need for improvement, where the Commission proposals need some support or needs to be changed?
I mean, you can refer to a lot of technicalities, but the question is, to some extent, I mean, all what we're describing, given a certain independence, looking much more to financial instruments and so on, but I mean, it's an allocation process. And the question is a little bit is, what should the allocation process address? I mean, yes, the valley of death and so on, we know all that, but the question is, what is the European dilemma if you talk about deep tech? And that is what Aguillon and others had been describing as the mid-tech dilemma. And more or less, if you see, and I do understand that might be boring for entrepreneurs, but from a public sector perspective, I mean, there is a certain pretension related to an allocation process which is supposed to top down, let's say, positively back up, say it more concisely, steer any kind of innovation process. And the question is, how do you set up this kind of using different funds in a cumulative way, and what will be the effect then literally for deep tech? And our fear is, to be honest, if a governance process is too much undefined, is more of an allocation nature of different kind of intentions, I think we will going to get from the industry side, and the input from the industry will come from big industry. And I think the question, I mean, that is the question for the room, is actually politically, I mean, you're staring to this podium and I mean, it's like in circus, you say plausible, not so plausible. I mean, the question is, where is your role in the societal, or say in the political process? And the problem is, if you have a top-down steering of innovation, what is the voice, or what is the direction we are going to formulate? Is it that what public servants or politicians believe? Or is it that more what is the market believes, but who is the market? And in the allocation process and the model so far, I mean, let's be honest, that had been steered by big corporates. I mean, the Siemens of that world, I mean, that was the super successful business model. Even in France, it was big corporates funded actually often 100 years ago. So what we see is a certain dilemma if this allocation process is not much more differentiated and also much more market-driven than driven by a kind of governance mechanism. We might be stuck yet again in the mid-tech dilemma. Because, I mean, the big OEMs, the automotive industry is now in Brussels saying we need a joint undertaking for the automotive industry. The aeronautic industry is saying the Chinese are coming, you know, we have to do something. The interesting thing is that the dynamism of the markets are coming from startups. And not just in economic terms, basically also in terms of innovation. So in a way, the dispute we have and the discussion we will have between the three institutions is how to set up a governance, on the one hand, not to pretend that you could steer by public servants or politicians innovation processes, because I think it's simply a lie and had been proven in economic history. And on the other hand, to some extent, give a voice, also a certain decision-making voice, but in consequence, having an effect, especially on what you're talking about for these 3 days. On startups, on deep techs, on young companies, the spin-offs of university. And I think that is the discussion we have to have. And I think the dispute a little bit like now is that we think it's a little bit too much in the ECF and the governance is a little bit too blurry. And we would like to go more to the instruments. And one practical example is that I said, okay, fine, whether you can really steer and talk about a seamless investment process on tier 1 or 2 or 3. I mean, this is basic research. I mean, you hardly find a company saying on tier 2 on nanotechnology, this is my business case and I want to have a seamless investment journey. And that's steered by a governance of an investment fund or the ECF. I think that we have to talk about technicalities in terms of, or instruments, that we say, okay, we have a research program, the funnel should be as broad as possible, but then from a certain TLN on, when there is entrepreneurship kicking in, when it's visible that we are going from research to a product, then we should align investment. And then we should decide what are priorities. And then it might make sense, it's a gamble anyway. But to do that from the very beginning in the basic research, I think it's a pretension, and it went completely wrong historically. Look to the MITI in Japan. You know, pretty much saying you're the biggest to Honda, you're the biggest scooter industry,
Christian,
don't buy a car. So I'm just saying it's the governance process.
Okay.
Where we have to fix.
Natalie has an urgent need to comment on that, but you have only 20 seconds before I wrap up. So,
thank you very much. Well, the Commission is always willing, you know, to facilitate the work of the co-legislators and to listen to proposals for improvements. And so we're talking about the governance. But I would say, just to add on what Mr. Ehler said, that, I mean, there is the issue of the governance, but we can look at it from an open manner, in the sense that what is going to be key for the coming years is going to be creating a real partnership. And the European Commission has proposed an innovation partnership, so working together with the innovators and working together with the investors. I am thinking of some initiatives that have been developed in some member states, like, for example, the TB initiative in France, in order to pool, you know, investments, in order to mobilize the investors together. And I think that this is also going to be one key element for the future. And then last but not least, 2 quick points. One, we need to make sure that having IP rights, intellectual property rights in Europe gives easier access to financing, and we need to work on this together. And point 2, there is a very strong role of the demand that public authorities can create. Public authorities need to help creating a market for our deep techs in Europe. I have seen too many innovators telling me that when the public authorities prepare the terms of reference, they do it in such a way that only the third country big names can submit. And so there, we need to create a demand, and Made in Europe plays a very strong role.
So thank you very much to the panel. I will thank you again when I finish my summary. You carefully maneuvered around the big elephants in the room. So, to be honest, these are the debate on defense R&D, and so where the political decisions have to meet and where place it. And I know that there are a couple of defense startups here in the room. The other thing is the relationship between the Competitiveness Fund and the Framework Program. So how much agility is needed, or will the ECF order innovation from the shelf, or will it be developed, or is there a timing issue when things are mature and when they are not mature to take over? And the role, the seamless integration or coordination with the Pillar 2, or the question to the ECF, where is the competition coordination tool, which was promised since a couple of months. And so what I would like to thank you very much again is that you open up the box open up the view into the workshop, because that is a process in the making. So please do yourself a favor, observe the debate about the midterm financial frame very carefully. It will be the negotiations will start. There is not only the whole budget of the Union for the next 7 years hanging on the line, it's the new design draft concerning competitiveness, or focusing on competitiveness, which is debated. Thank you very again, Nathalie, for your input, and Christian for your input from the Parliament perspective, and Michael for the EIC, which is a startup operation. And to give this a punchline at the end, you said that the politicians were not concerned of losing money. Officials in the Commission have the same. It's because it's not their money, it's the taxpayers' money. And but there really is a concern, and we learned that in the EIC during the startup operation, when we set up a set of KPIs and monitoring them quarterly, is that the officials are concerned that they are measured against the impact they have with the actions and the money they take in their hands. But maybe that is what we need, an impact orientation, even with the possibility to make failures and then to correct it quickly again. So having said that, thank you very much for the panel again. Please give them a hand.
Thank you to you.
And we exceeded 5 minutes. I'm sorry for that. So.